Yes, I'm technically challenged, so thank you very much. Also, hair raising is the word. You can see I lost it all. Dr. van Vuuren, thanks so much for extending the invitation and providing this lovely setting for tonight's discussion. Really appreciate this. And for getting such subversive elements on my left and right here to join me. And talking about subversive elements, there are many in this audience who have been through a great deal of subversion over the years. And I'm glad to see them here with me, and with us rather. So, the book, Armed and Dangerous, it was written whilst I was on the run from the Special Branch, largely written then, in 1990. Just after Operation Vula was exposed, and I'd been in the country with Mag Maharaj and Siphiwe Nyanda, who had come in way before me, was to set up an underground network of leadership. There had been an underground built up over the years, but the leaders were lacking. I came in very late, in fact, in 1990. With the unbanning of the ANC, Maharaj and I were indemnified, although a certain F.W. de Klerk didn't know we were already in the country, and the ANC didn't want them to know that, so they told us to skedaddle, to get out and then to come back as very good people. Here we are, ready to join in the process of negotiation. Whilst that happened, Siphiwe Nyanda and others who were still underground were discovered, and with a lot of information. And it suddenly struck de Klerk that we had been in before, as though that was a great sin. It was a crazy notion of his that we were upsetting the entire negotiation process. Because if anything, the ANC and Communist Party and MK underground were underground for ages. 1950 on the Communist Party and 1960 on the PAC and the ANC. But the Special Branch, who were trying to up the ante and, you know, create that tension of the time. And you can remember what was taking place with the IFP and the hit squads, the so-called Third Force, the killings taking place in 1990. He tried to make out that the communists were out to upset the apple cart of negotiations and were actually acting against Mandela. It was all totally false. But anyway, the upshot of it was that Maharaj was arrested with Nyanda and others, and I managed to evade arrest and was underground, not for the first time in my life, with the police hunting me. And this brings me to the title, Armed and Dangerous. It's really a tongue-in-cheek title because it's the Special Branch who referred to me as Armed and Dangerous, and they had photographs on the television, said to the good law-abiding people of this country, don't go near him and his colleagues, they're armed and dangerous. We managed to remain in hiding for another year, in which time the Mandela had stressed to de Klerk that there could be no negotiations whilst we were on the run. We had to be indemnified again. So it was quite a year for me, 1990 into 1991, and I had a lot of time on my hands. And I had just begun, having been born BBC, born before computers. I learnt how to use a computer in that year, and the thing that I began to do was to write this book. And that's when the book was written. I completed it the following year, and it was published in the first case by Heinemann, an English publisher, and came out in 1993. In 1999, Jonathan Ball, the publisher here, wanted to bring it out under South African title, and he took the rights with my agreement from Heinemann and brought out a 1999 second edition in which he asked me to add chapters. So I added to that the period of our great election of '94, which changed things in so much, and became the Deputy Minister of Defence. So with the second edition was added about 5 chapters dealing with that period. The book did very well all along, and by 2004, the same Jonathan Ball wanted me to update it to 2004, and he came out with a 3rd edition. It's quite unusual coming out with these editions, and prevailed on me to write about the period from 1999 to 2004, in which I was the minister now, in that period of water and forestry, which was the best time of my life in government, actually, because that was delivering water to our people, and especially the millions of rural people who hadn't had water before. And that was the 3rd edition. And that was it. Until my new publisher, Jacana, down the road, and they're selling copies here tonight, they had published a book of mine about a specific period in our history, just 1960 to 63 in Durban, in which my late wife had been arrested and detained and dealt with very brutally, and subsequently escaped from custody. So that was a book called The Unlikely Secret Agent about Eleanor, and they did very well with that book. So they felt they would now like to also acquire this particular book with its long lifespan now, and a 4th edition. And I said to them, okay, this time round, I am not adding any chapters, which they wanted me to. They wanted me to update it to Polokwane and to the period when I became Minister of Intelligence. And I thought about it and I said, you know, that's going to be another book entirely, and I'll write that much later. It's very different, and it's got to really look at some very serious questions about governance in this country and what had happened to the ANC. But I did say that I would write an introduction for this book for them, and that's what's been added. Introduction, which deals with what the book is really about, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But having dealt with that in the introduction, I then asked the question, was the struggle really worthwhile? The sacrifices, which is what all the young people, so-called born frees, ask, as well as older people like some of us here tonight. And I deal with that in the introduction. What about the sacrifices? Was it worthwhile, given some of the problems and deep problems, complex problems, systemic, economic, and of course corruption at personal levels, etc. I wrote that introduction for this book, and that introduction's created quite a controversy because it is rather controversial, and I'm sure we'll hear more about this from the two with me on the panel. Let me, in the little time left, for me, I don't want to hold all the time. You said 20 to 30 minutes, and I'm going to stick, and I'll stick to 20. So in say about 5 minutes, to say that what I would say this book is about, first of all, it's a memoir. So it's written from a personal point of view, about an individual's life story. And we're seeing many of these testaments coming out now, struggle record from a whole range of people. And that's very good because it helps us all to understand what the struggle was about. And with my book, as with the others, it's what brings an individual into a struggle. And in South Africa, what were those conditions? So we come from very different backgrounds. I happen to come from a lower class, Jewish, white background in Yeovil. And I would think that the book, dealing with a young kid who was really just sports loving, growing up in the Yeovil of the 40s and into the 50s, what on earth could have led me into embracing a struggle for the liberation of all our people? And of course, primarily, in the first place, our African oppressed majority, and all those who were suffering under apartheid. And there are many whites, including in the room here tonight. Luli Kalinikos over here is someone I met, aged 20, and I'm not asking your age, Luli, I think we're probably about the same age. And Luli was in an organisation called the Congress of Democrats, and I met her there. So I met her long before the old professor here ever met his wife. I deal with that period of schooling and what it was like as a kid, and then with me the fact that there was a rebellious streak, and the book goes into the reasons for that. I looked further afield as actually a young teenager, especially into matric, at our fellow countrymen and women, and became friendly across the colour line. And the kind of people I became friendly with would be the kind of our comrades and friends here tonight with the darker pigmentation, who were writing or playing music or poetry, working for Golden City Post and Drum Magazine, etc. And I became involved in that milieu. And Sharpeville then occurred, and that made me look for the ANC and become a full-time activist over the next few years, joining MK. And the book really is about Umkhonto weSizwe, why it came into being, why somebody like myself and hundreds and thousands of other activists would join, why they would sacrifice. It's not just about me, it's a memoir and it's personal, but it's about an individual's role in a struggle for national liberation. So it's about all the wonderful people I became involved with over the years who sacrificed their liberty and their very lives and suffered immensely, and the betrayals and exile, and how we said never say die after the Mandela, Sisulu, Gombeki arrests and Bram Fisher, to just keep going from exile, linked in with the country and the people inside, and how we then set up our training camps in places like Angola, and our underground structures from Mozambique and Swaziland, Lesotho, Botswana, through to Zimbabwe, Zambia, and right through to London, where we operated as well, Dr. Dadu, Joe Slovo, and so many others, all under the leadership of Oliver Tambo. So the book takes in that entire sweep of history, and those many years, 30 years or so, in which the flag of the movement was kept flying, people involved were those of immense integrity. Nobody served because they were looking for money, wealth, fame, fortune. This isn't what you received. It's a very, very different factor to what people perhaps these days are looking for. The book deals with the 4 pillars of struggle. So there's the mass political, there's MK, there's the underground, and there's international solidarity. And it makes very clear that the struggle is won by the people of South Africa, doing incredibly courageous things, sung and unsung heroes. And it doesn't go into the mass movement inside the country. That must be somebody else's memoir and research, etc. I was outside. But I make it clear that the MK actions were really, although we didn't realize this at times, we came to understand it more later in the struggle, that it wasn't the Cuban, Vietnamese type armed struggle, where we would come marching down Elof Street and Kanishka Street with our AK-47s and our Che Guevara berets, which is exactly what I thought would be the case when we were training in the Soviet Union in 1964. That's how we envisaged it. But it was really that MK acted in terms of armed propaganda actions, inspiring our people, showing that there was always something there. And I would say that this helped to activate the morale and the commitment of many people in the country who formed wonderful organizations, trade unions, the UDF, etc. And really it's together those four elements of struggle that in the end bring about the overthrow of apartheid. I want to just end on this point, that we living, well, let me make this the penultimate point, okay? We live at a time now where people aren't so clear about what that struggle was about, which is why it's important that these memoirs are written. And there are a number of academics, conservative academics, race relations, Stable and others, who would have it that MK was an entire failure. And that's because we didn't win by an armed insurrection. And they're looking for a straw man there. They're creating something that this was not about. We might have over time, and indeed in the Communist Party, we had an insurrectionary theory and a path to power, but there was always the question that negotiations could in fact come about. The point is that MK played its role, and I've used the term in the psychological sense. It inspired the black majority. It put great fright and fear in the minds of those who ruled the country, who were absolutely terrified that armed actions would link in terms of an incredible synergy with the mass struggle, and that the Red Revolution would come. So it played a huge role, but it was a secondary role. So I want to make that point, and to end with the introduction, which perhaps, because of the time factor during question time, it might come up, but certainly in relation to that question, was the sacrifice worthwhile? I would say absolutely. We achieved the unthinkable, and that was we smashed white supremacy for once and for all. We overthrew apartheid. We created a democracy in our country. And there have been great achievements in our country since 1994. Now, that doesn't mean that we've achieved the utopia of our dreams. It doesn't mean that with the political equality which we all have, it doesn't matter who you are, your vote weighs the same. So we've got political equality, and not just in relation to the vote, in relation to all aspects of the political sphere. Certainly, when it comes to economic and social equality, there's a long way to go, and every country faces that. But it's 20 years in now, and I mentioned things that we all know and people speak about, the unemployment and the corruption and so on. And within this, I asked where we went wrong. And I basically feel that in the very important concessions that needed to be made by Mandela, and it's not just him, it's all of us who were involved in the movement. It's a collective leadership. It wasn't just him or Thabo and Becky. Everybody played their role and could debate and agree or not. But the concessions, and I say they were very necessary, it spared us from a bloody civil war. And the reconciliation which is meant to go with that is important. But I am of the view that we were far too lenient in the economic sphere, and that we should have been much tougher. And at a time when not just our own capitalist ruling class, but international capital, was in a situation where I don't believe they would have intervened if South Africa had at that stage gone for some form of social public ownership of the height of the economy and the mines and so on. This is well before Malema and company. That we could have gone for a huge wealth tax. We could have demanded of the mining houses that after their century of plunder and exploitation, they needed a restitution. It was needed, in which they should have paid huge amounts into the public fiscus so that we would have been in a better position to help the poor of our land. And we made so many other concessions in terms of a more so-called liberal, open market with lack of real control. I'm not saying nationalization of everything, but the strategic path in which a government of the people, in terms of the Freedom Charter, should have been ensuring greater control of the economy. And without that having happened, as is still the case to this day, I think so many of our ills have emerged, including the ripeness of corruption and of Gate and Gupta Gate and whatever gates you care to call it. But this is just to give you then a overview that you asked me to do, and to then open myself up to interrogation from those with me and from you in the audience as well. So siyabonga kakhulu, thanks very much.
Thank you. I think Ronnie's covered pretty much everything that I was going to talk about, so sorry if I'm going to repeat some of the issues that have already been covered. But just to say that it's really a great pleasure and a privilege to have been asked to comment on this fourth edition of Ronnie Kasrils' autobiography, Armed and Dangerous. It was one of the first books that I read as I started to become interested in South African history and politics as an undergraduate student at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. And I like to think that the book probably influenced my decision to do a PhD on the South African liberation movement, so I am especially honored. So the book was first published in '93 as South Africa was coming out of a very difficult and violent transition period, and on the eve of the first democratic elections. And you know, while autobiography and biography have over the last 20 years really become quite a separate mode of historical writing within the field of liberation history, at the time that the book first came out, it was really seminal. There weren't that many biographies and autobiographies in particular around at the time. So it probably did encourage or start this trend in autobiographical writing that's become very important in South African struggle history. It's also unique in the sense that the book has gone through, as we've heard, 3 additional editions, which have taken the narrative past the 1994 moment, which again is something that very few, especially autobiographical works, have done, having rather chosen to deal with the struggle against apartheid, but very few works that I can think of have ventured into sort of more murky waters of the transition and of the ANC in government. So this latest edition has a new introduction which poses a number of really self-critical questions about the failings and the increasing dysfunctions of the ruling party, and Ronnie does so with a frankness and honesty that, you know, without recusing himself of responsibility for decisions that were taken. And I think this is really a testament to the ability of the leadership of the ANC and the SACP to question themselves and to open up for debate and to assess circumstances and to learn from mistakes in order to be able to overcome difficult moments throughout the history of the liberation movement, as for example happened during the Morogoro Conference of 1969. And arguably this tradition of self-criticism, which has been a characteristic of communists all over the world, and in Italy, where I come from, we call this practice autocritica. Arguably, this tradition has become increasingly eroded in recent years, and obviously the big question remains as to whether the ANC will be able to emerge from the present state of decay. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the book and what it covers. So it starts with Ronnie's rapid politicization and involvement in the liberation movement, which really was prompted by the Sharpeville shootings, and after which really he catapulted himself into the thick of it, so to speak. And at the time, he was based in Durban, and he was part of the discussions amongst the ANC and its allies in what was then the Congress Alliance around the decision to embark on armed struggle through a sabotage campaign. And the book provides an interesting account of the underground network that was operating in Durban, which I think hasn't really been looked at in many of the accounts of the struggle, which have tended to focus on Johannesburg as the main center of events, and to a lesser extent on Cape Town. And it was in Durban that Ronnie met Eleanor, his late wife, who was one of, or perhaps the first female MK operative involved in sabotage actions in the Durban area. And Ronnie has written a very moving book about the story of her arrest and detention and her escape from prison, which she managed to pull off basically on her own, and that was published 2 years ago. In 1963, Ronnie and Eleanor, who were both on the run from the police, escaped via Botswana and arrived in Tanzania, where the ANC, under the leadership of Oliver Tambo, had set up its external headquarters in Dar es Salaam at the time. And while Eleanor worked for the ANC office in Dar, Ronnie went off to Odessa, a city on the Black Sea in the Soviet Union, to undergo military training. And this was with a generation of MK recruits that left the country in the 1960s and became known in the movement as the Mgwenya, and they were really the pioneers of the armed struggle. And after coming back from the Soviet Union, he spent some time in a camp called Kongwa that was in the central region of Tanzania. And after that, Ronnie and Eleanor married and soon after established a home in London where their children were born, and where, I should add, Ronnie became an Arsenal supporter for the better or the worse.
Be careful.
We've got Spurs at the back of the room. It seems that Eleanor in London, it was Eleanor who was really the breadwinner of the family, and this seems also to have been the case in many other families in exile, especially those based in Western countries. While Ronnie worked in the small SACP office in Guj Street with people like Yusuf Dadu and Joe Slovo, and from here they raised funds for the ANC external mission and MK, but also started to recruit and to train a number of people to become secret operatives for the liberation movement. And some of these were young South Africans, among them Ahmed Timol, Raymond Suttner and David Rodkin. But also they included foreign volunteers from Communist Party and from the left of British politics, really, and their stories have been recently recorded in a book called London Recruits, which came out last year. Following the Soweto uprising, which really swelled the ranks of MK, as black youths left the country in droves and joined the ANC in exile, Ronnie was deployed first to the GDR, East Germany, and then to Angola in the new camps there to give political classes to this new generation of recruits. And after that he was again deployed to the eastern front lines, so first in Mozambique and then after the Nkomati Accord to Swaziland. And I think it's Ronnie's memories of his experience in the camps that is perhaps my favorite part of the book. Well, the scholarship on MK has to a large extent failed to capture what life in the camps was like, except for talking about the discontent and the crisis and the mutinies. So much so that there is a danger that the history of the ANC in exile is going to be written as one of constant crisis. Ronnie provides an interesting, an extremely human account of everyday life in the camps, and he talks about the kind of ideological debates that were going on amongst cadres, the kind of food they ate, what they liked to eat and didn't like to eat, how the camp structure was organized, how what the daily activities were, from drilling exercises to political classes to football matches and so on. And Ronnie really has an incredible memory for names and for people, not just of those in the leadership. And the book paints a series of very moving portraits of those who made up the ranks of MK, who they were, what drove them to join the struggle against apartheid, what their dreams were, what their frustrations were in exile. And too many of the names that Ronnie mentions in the book, people that he trained and worked with, died in action or as a result of cross-border attacks by the army or the secret police. And while fears of infiltration could sometimes escalate into imagined conspiracies, and the detention of suspects did lead in some cases to abuses, the long list of names of fallen comrades in the book is really a powerful reminder of just how real and painful the consequences of infiltration were. It is also a reminder that while geopolitical obstacles and the military might of the apartheid regime prevented MK from waging a conventional guerrilla war, the armed struggle was not just a case of armed propaganda, as some of the literature has suggested. And for 30 years, the whole of Southern Africa, the whole of the region was involved in a war which had huge human and political costs. And Ronnie's spoken about some of the impact of the escalation of armed activity at a psychological level. But also I wanted to mention the military defeat of the South Africans at the hands of the Cubans in Angola in 1988, which really paved the way for Namibia's independence and in turn opened the way for the negotiated transition in South Africa. And this war was dragged out by the National Party until the very bitter end. And the political violence of the 1990s really is testament to this. So that by trying to weaken the ANC, the National Party could seek a negotiated solution that was on its own terms.
3 minutes, please.
Sure. I'm almost done. And Ronnie's already spoken of his return to South Africa and of having to go underground again after the exposition of Operation Vula. which really was being used by the National Party to discredit the integrity of the ANC in the negotiation process. I'll just just to conclude that the book really makes for a very gripping read, and its wittiness and self-humor often made me laugh. There's a part where Ronnie talks about hearing about the movement with capital M for the first time, and he thought at the time that they were referring to the Royal Ballet Company that was touring from Britain at the time. And then there are some very funny jokes about the Cubans in Angola, but you'll have to read the book to get the punchline. And the book is dedicated to the Born Frees, and I especially encourage them to read it. In spite of the disillusionment with the present, which is evident from the introduction, I hope that Ronnie's revolutionary life will be an inspiration for this and many more generations to come to continue to struggle for a more just and better future.
Right, thank you, Professor van Vuren, colleagues, comrades, friends. I'm very envious of Ronnie Kasrils, not because he got to know my wife before I did, but because he's written such an exciting and gripping book. And it's actually now in its 4th edition. And the books that I write, my wife tells me, are the kind of books that once you put them down, you can't pick them up again. So I'm a little bit on the back foot here, Ronnie. But Armed and Dangerous is a rich contribution to the growing body of autobiographical writing on the South African struggle. And Ariane has actually outlined it very eloquently, how that's emerged. I mean, simply put, these books that have emerged can be divided into two. There are those who celebrate the anti-apartheid struggle and those who are hostile to it. I think you mentioned the Institute of Race Relations, Paul Trewila's Inside Quantra. They're two very different kinds of literature. However, there is a third type that is emerging, and the latest edition, that is the 4th edition of Armed and Dangerous, is the latest example of this third type, where long-standing and highly respected activists begin to question the ANC achievements in the post-apartheid period. Jay Naidoo's, who was of course the General Secretary of COSATU, his autobiography, Struggle for Justice, is one example. Ronnie Kasrils' 4th edition, and I'm going to focus on the 4th edition of Armed and Dangerous, is another example. They have been called post-power radicals. Post-power radicals. They are men who have exemplary records as anti-apartheid activists. They've experienced a period in power as cabinet ministers, for example, in the case of Jay Naidoo and Ronnie, and have become increasingly critical of the ANC after they have left power. That is the ANC after 1994. Now, in preparing this evening discussion, I first read the 1993 edition of Armed and Dangerous, which I confess, Ronnie, I hadn't read before. I hadn't done my homework, I'm sure. I found it very readable, and I really loved the account of your early life and your political awakening, and of course your decision to join Kunti Wesizwe, one of the first whites to do so. What is especially interesting, and what I was looking for, Ronnie, in the first edition, were moments of doubt or questioning in the first edition. They are not prominent, but they do, I think, reading it, they reveal your integrity and your questioning mind. You express doubts about the GDR, the German Democratic Republic, East Germany as we call it. You have these wonderful accounts of debates with Ruth First and your discussions. You reflect on the difference between freedom fighters and terrorists. And you mention the abuses in the camps in Angola. But these reflections in the first edition are rather muted. And the unequivocal critique of the post-ANC government, the post-1994 ANC government, in the fourth edition, came to me as a surprise. And I'd like to, in the time I have, Madam Chair, go for it. I'd like to comment on the critique contained in the introduction and raise some questions around its implications. I think Ariane has given a wonderful account of the book, and a very thoughtful one. Essentially what Ronnie argues is that the ANC lost its soul in the early 90s to corporate capital and became trapped in neoliberalism, selling out its people in a Faustian bargain. He argues this unequivocally in the introduction. And he focused to illustrate this Faustian bargain. To illustrate it, he focuses on the International Monetary Fund's loan in 1993 to what was to become the new government, which he believes captures the Faustian bargain with corporate capital. And he suggests, and he touched on it this evening, that the ANC could have moved in a more progressive direction without these kinds of concessions to capital, to international capital. And he ends up by calling for a revitalization of the ANC. And I quote, "The ANC's soul needs to be restored. Its traditional values and culture of service and sacrifice needs to be reinstated." Now, I think it's very powerfully argued. But what I would like to address is that, and my observation, Ronnie, is why does the ANC make the shift? Is it simply greed, as Raymond Suttner seems to suggest in his article in the Mail and Guardian? What was, and what's your explanation for this rightward shift? I would argue that, and I'm putting it to you as a proposition, that the cause of the ANC's rightward shift was the fact that it had demobilized, or there was a demobilization of the internal democratic movement, the United Democratic Front, the marginalization of COSATU. And underlying this demobilization of the internal democratic movement, which you suggested this in a way. You kind of, I thought you were stealing my thunder, but you haven't, I don't think. I don't think you quite have. But that underlying this demobilization of the internal struggle, which you said was such a central factor, if it was such a central factor, why was it demobilized? And I think underlying that is a particular theory of transition that's dominant in political science. And it says if you want to go from an authoritarian government to a democratic government, you've got to establish an elite pact. You've got to bring the moderates together and isolate the right wing and isolate the left wing. That's how you build a consensus, and that's how you move forward. Now, I think that that model is flawed. I think it distorts the left. I think that what you had in South Africa is a social movements that were using their power in strategic ways and shaped this transition, shaped the constitution, shaped the research and development program, the RDP, which was the central political platform of the ANC. And let me illustrate, just if I may, Madam Chair, just to kind of bring on my point. E.H. Carr, the English historian, says that what you see depends on which side of the mountain you stand. Ronnie, you stood in Lusaka. I stood in Johannesburg. So looking at it from Johannesburg, a survey of Kasrils shop stewards in 1991, which I conducted, I asked them, who do you want to represent you in the transition? 70% said they should be represented at CODESA, which was about to happen. This is 1993, 20 years ago, exactly. And 70% said they want to be represented in the political negotiations by COSATU, not by the ANC, not by the South African Communist Party. I mean, there's 21% ANC, 9% the overwhelming majority. Indeed, the CEC of COSATU at the time resolved that they would either be represented by COSATU or not at all. So looking at it from my side of the mountain, I see the shift taking place much earlier. And why did COSATU take this independent position? Why were they arguing that they wanted to be represented? The reason is, and you've actually made the point yourself, Ronnie, the reason is that they played the central role, a constructive role, in creating the conditions for the transition. They had developed an effective strategy that combined mass mobilization with negotiations. That was how the transition, way before CODESA, 1990, the Labora Minute, employers, unions, negotiating how to take the country forward. Okay, that's fine, thank you. Be very generous. And I think they were the force behind the Reconstruction Development Program. Now, I don't want to bend the stick too far, because I'm not for 1 minute suggesting that sanctions, armed struggle, and so were not important. What I would argue is that this was the driving democratic grassroots force that was driving a socio-economic agenda, not just a political one. That's why they wanted to be represented by COSATU, because they wanted to ensure that we wouldn't follow the post-colonial path, where the moment you came to power, you established this predatory elite and you crushed the labour movement. That's why they argued for an independent trade union. So, what I'm suggesting, Ronnie, by marginalising COSATU, The ANC were laying the foundations for an elite pact. Now, and this is the difficult one, I think, for you, because your close comrade and friend, Chris Hani, recognized this. He recognized this. And when Ronnie Kalinikas interviewed him for 4 hours, 8 hours, 8 days before he was assassinated. He was assassinated in April. 8th, was it? End of March, 1993. When Ronnie Kalinikas interviewed him, this is what he said. He said there's a new enemy. There's a new struggle. It's a socio-economic struggle. The key danger we face is corruption. What we need is to be open to all the movements, all the social movements, all the different strands, and build a democratic movement. In Gramscian terms, if I may revert to Marxist theory, he was shifting from the war of maneuver to the war of position. The war of maneuver was the idea that you smash the state, you overthrow it, you have an insurrection, uprising, the kind of ideas that you said drove you in the 1960s. That's the war of maneuver, smash the state. But Gramsci, writing in the 30s, realizing that it's a more complex process, the transformation of capitalist society, you had to build up the trenches of civil society in order to be able to advance. And smashing the state was not necessarily going to create democracy. That you had to build up democracy within society. Chris Hani recognized that, and he chose not to go to Parliament. He didn't go to Parliament. Instead, he said, I must go back to the base. We must build the social movements. I will become Secretary General of the South African Communist Party, and I won't take the gravy train. That was a moral and a political decision. Now, Ronnie, in retrospect, do you think the demobilization of the eternal... Look, that's a slightly polemical point, because I think it was in a process. It wasn't simply its closing down. The process of demobilization had already begun. But do you think the demobilization of the internal movement was inevitable? Or could it have emerged as an equal partner in the post-apartheid period? Thank you.
Would like to respond?
Yes. Well, okay. Just to first say thanks to both of you. I really, Ariana, was so impressed to see that you know the book inside out, and you actually described it better than I do. Thanks very much. It was very insightful, and I think you brought a tremendous freshness to the way you read it, etc. And of course, there was a good division of labour here, because on the one hand you did your work, and then for Eddie, coming in and the critique and focusing where you did, I think that was very necessary, and I would say very rewarding for the evening that we have before us here. It'll be very interesting to get inputs and the questions from the floor. You know, Eddie, in 1990, while I was on the run, I wrote a piece for Work in Progress, and it was on the need to continue to mobilize the people behind the process. And already then, one could see, in 1990, now you see, you talk about from what side of the mountain you view things, and it's very easy to understand the metaphor in terms of being outside in exile and being in the armed struggle mainly, as to being inside the country and involved, as Eddie and Luli had been so well, to their credit, in the emergent movement here, the trade unions, the working class particularly. But there's also a the difference in angles on that mountain, where you can be sitting in the same suburb of Yeovil or Johannesburg, and in terms of the trench that you occupy, seeing things very differently. So if you underground, rather than like my colleagues, who were now free and able to go and meet with the clerks and so on, and begin the negotiations, you seeing things totally differently. And Chris Hani was in Umtata, being protected by one Bantu Holomisa at that time, yes, and I would say very much to Holomisa's credit, because we really admired him, and he showed an integrity, and I think the ANC under Mandela dealt very badly with him in disciplining, because he said that Stella Sipkau had taken a bribe from Sol Kersner. I mean, for that, he was expelled from the ANC. It's quite remarkable. I think he is a man of integrity. But Chris was in the Transkei with a lot of MK people and continuing to train people for the struggle. I was underground in the cities of the country. We met often under the auspices of Holomisa in the Transkei. So we did see things in a similar way. And I wrote for that work in progress while I was in some safe house in Bez Valley, and was very acutely sensitive to what was going on with my colleagues above board, and I knew that there were a number of them saying, what the hell is Ronnie doing in the country, and giving secret statements and messages to the press and criticising the clerk, he should be sent out the country. That made me very sensitive to whether there were developments, I don't want to say a sellout, but negative to the development of the revolution. And I was reading, funnily enough, a letter that I'd written to Eleanor. I read it just the other day. I found 23 letters, Lily, and I wrote to her in that period. And I'm reading it to put into my archive at Wits, and there's one letter that is so critical of the leadership that I'm thinking to myself, I can't, this is far too critical to put into the public domain even after my death. And I don't like secrecy, so it will come out. But I was absolutely amazed, and if I'd had that and could have read that before I wrote the introduction, I probably would have remarked more about where you talking, because it wasn't inevitable. The question that Eddie Webster puts to me at the end, was it inevitable that we would have gone down that route? And it's not that Chris Hani was assassinated as an explanation of why it wasn't challenged more. In other words, this elitist pact that was taking place, which is what I deal with the introduction. It wasn't on the cards, it wasn't written as a destiny, but what I say in the introduction, and I now, as a Ronnie, Kasrils, Red Ronnie, I emerge after a year of underground being sensitive to it. And now I'm with the leadership, and I'm under the very strong control of Nelson Mandela, who on a number of issues, unlike Oliver Tambo, is not one to allow debates to go on and on. And in fact, the non-negotiable statement of Mandela in relation to gear is where we were told in no uncertain terms in 1996 that we were going for gear, and that meant the end to the RDP of J. Naidu, and nobody could argue with Madiba. And everybody was on board, and to actually stand up against a leadership which is so strong and united, and with such a tall man, such a big man as Mandela, and to go down in flames, and to be prepared to get out of that movement at that time because he wanted to disagree was not an easy thing, because you see, at the end of the day, you would think, well, I'm Minister of Water and Forests, or I was Deputy Defence. I'm doing something good and I'm getting on with that job. But I'm very strong in the self-critique of saying, how could have we, communists, Marxists, people who prided ourselves on being Marxists, let alone left or social democratic ANC, how could we allow a situation to take place where under Mandela we put clause 3 of the Freedom Charter, the economic clauses, the clause on the back burner, and nationalisation was then a dirty word, and it's left to the red beret young man Malema to capture it now and come out with it, because the Communist Party and the ANC just left it in the lurch. This is the problem, and this is what I'm saying. In terms of where we might differ, because I agree with so much of what you've said, the Gramscian aspect and so on. The question, which I had a short chat with Luli beforehand, trying to find out what you were going to say. No, just in
She's a loyal wife.
my discussion, I know I'm going on a bit long here, but I agree that we made a major error in after 1990 and the 94 period, the negotiation period, that the trade unions and the working class, yes, the Communist Party were there, and Chris was there in 93, but there was the demobilization of the internal forces in the country who had been so vital to bringing about the change. I think that's a major error. Now, Eric Hobsbawm, the great historian, has said that it's no good looking back in history and saying, well, if we hadn't done this and we hadn't done that, if only we had taken a different decision, things could be so much better. And he goes on to basically say that, well, that's futile exercise. Get on with putting things right now. I've got to go back to Eric Hobsbawm in terms of what he means by that, because you see where I agree with you in unpicking or unpacking the things that we missed, the mistakes that we made back in the 1990s, helps us to put things right now. Now, I don't want to go into a long lecture, but one of those things that we need to learn is the organized, disciplined working class in the trade union movement needing to be to the fore under political leadership. I'm not saying Communist Party or ANC, but trade unions must be, and it's the working class and it's organized labor, that if we're going to put things right, we must learn that lesson, that we demobilized our people at that stage. And the whole challenge for us now, which is why my view is we've got to look into, from the Communist Party to the ANC to COSATU, and I go much further. I talk about the left forces, the pro-socialist forces of our country, that we've got to open up a debate and ask, why is it that we are not getting on top of the poverty problem, the poor education, the unemployment, etc.? What is it? What is needed? The kind of debate we're having tonight. The final point that I'd like to say, which I didn't hear from you, were you analysing what the major error is. What I'm saying the major error is that we have moved in terms of the economic model, and I'm not calling for the East European socialist model, but that we took a decision, and it started after Madiba comes back from Davos in 1992, and he says that we can't talk about nationalisation, that the question of taking over the mines and the heights of the economy, this will ruin us, we won't get, and this is the silver bullet that's talked about, direct foreign investment, as though that's the answer to our problems, and not the working class and the working people united with the alliances of the patriots of a country to seize by steps the control of the economic heights of our country. And I'm not saying you nationalize everything like Malem is saying, but where we have the strategic control. And if we've got mineral wealth, then a man called Chavez understood that his country's oil wealth meant that the control of that oil wealth could really begin to deal with the economic problems of that country. And Latin American countries are showing that this is the way. And my last favorite example of it, I know we're giving examples outside Africa, but it's little Norway and Britain, which isn't very great. But they discover oil in the late 50s, early 60s, in the lake between them, the North Sea, rich in oil. And Britain goes the privatized route. And it's made, like is happening in our country through mineral wealth, it makes a small, hugely prosperous group of the wealthy in the country linked to the wealthy capitalists of the world. And the rest of the country and the people suffer. Norway, across that lake, they nationalized their oil. They set up the Norwegian Oil Fund. And 1/3 of the GDP of Norway goes into creating the infrastructure, the social provisions for the people of Norway, and that oil has helped them. So this is where I see the main problem. It is in the demobilization factor, but it's got to link in to the kind of economic system that we have in this country. And I'm all for going through the building of the alliance for that in mind. Thank you.
Let's open it up. Okay. So we're ready to take the questions. I think let's take 3 or 4 and then you respond. Okay.
Thank you very much, Chair Lady. My name is Paul. I'm coming from Brixton, SIC coordinator there. I do have one question to the Prof, and then 2 questions to the Kasrils, and my last comment. Prof, I just want to find out actually, you may be related with the late David Webster. That's my question, that was. And what I want to know from you is that the time when discussion took place in terms of the item to lift the arms struggle, after the decision which was being taken in that particular meeting, what is your running around in your mind? The sort of question is that when maybe you go and meet the cadres abroad, because that decision was taken inside the country, still when the guys are still outside. So they want to meet the guys outside, maybe after maybe the matter was given to them. What maybe more or less the debate discussion between yourself and them as you work with them for the long time. My comment is that other point which is we did a mistake on in startup to leave RDP out. Because the plan was that in the RDP we have to make sure, an example, Alexander today or tomorrow must be do the same as Santi. Thank you.
Thank you for the question, presentation. I've been brought and armed and dangerous from undercover struggle to freedom. My issues at stake, I find a lot of your chant, I think, in the 4th edition pro Zimbabwe. I am Zimbabwe. I've got a PhD student here trying to defend leadership. issues in Zimbabwe, in what I'm trying to write for university. I'm saying, to what extent is your thinking prepared to go the Zimbabwean route? We have seen what has happened in Zimbabwe, the nationalization that has taken place in Zimbabwe, the reforms, the pro-poor reforms that have taken place in Zimbabwe, and the way they've been condemned in terms of its radical nature. And I'm saying now, if we had those agreements during the struggle that you're going to move on and probably go pro-poor, change the power relations, change the economical relations, to what extent are you prepared in South Africa to take the Rupa and Mugabe road? Thank you.
As a member of the working class and an ex-Igasa member, I joined them in the late 80s as a teenager or late teens, revealing my age in the process. I've noted a selectivity among yourself, not only yourself but other members of the alliance, and that is in your selectivity in criticizing certain countries. You criticize Israel, and there's a certain amount of justification in that. I don't hear you criticize Cuba. I don't hear you criticize the detention of Hector Palacios, the other Cuban dissidents, the lack of freedoms. In your book, your criticism of the GDR was very rooted, and it seemed to come at the very end. You hook, line and sinker accepted the explanation by the East Germans that the war was there, the border was there to keep the evil West Germans out, etc., etc. So there seems to be a selectivity when it comes to advocating liberty and human rights. As for a command economy, I have a relative who is in foreign affairs in the South American theatre. Chavez had to import refined oil, petrol, from the US in his last months in government. That despite having oil reserves second to Saudi Arabia. So much for the planned economy, the central economy. I'm not terribly impressed with it, and I think we've seen what's happened in Eastern Europe. That's basically, yeah, so that's what I have to ask, and a few other questions, but I'm going to hold the microphone. I think there's a number of other people.
Do you want to answer first, or can we go another one?
Maybe we take 3 at a time, otherwise
Three, okay,
people
that
will
was-
forget. Yeah, I think
okay.
3 at a time.
So if you
Do
respond.
you guys want to answer?
You go
any?
first. You go.
Can I lead some?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. Just thanks very much for the comment from the frontier. A decision really armed struggle. As I understood you, you asked how the comrades outside the country responded to the decision we took inside the country to embark on armed struggle, which was the case in December 1961, when MK announced its existence. The decisions were taken in the course of that year. We were the first of us were recruited in about December 1961 into MK. At that stage, there weren't many people outside the country. It wasn't like the exile situation in later years. Certainly there were just a very few leaders, like Tambo and Dadu had been sent out just after Sharpeville to set up the ANC presence outside the country. And of course the ANC and the Communist Party had people travelling from here abroad, and they would meet Dadu and Tambo in London and explain to them what the thinking was. And they in fact endorsed the decision that way. This was the situation. It wasn't that we had many of our members outside. Within the country, discussions took place amongst leaders. We see this in Mandela's book, but it was also taking place amongst younger people in what we call Soweto today, mainly in the black areas, people there realizing the need to resort to violent forms of struggle and not just the non-violent struggle methods that had existed for almost 49 years, in fact 50 years virtually, of the ANC's existence. The second question about Zim. You see, the main problem that I think we have with what's taken place in Zimbabwe in latter years. It started off in 1980, and for about 10 or more years, the developments there were very good. And we see this particularly in terms of education and in health. And you see results of this to this day among Zimbabweans coming to this country. They've really benefited from that education system. I lived in Zimbabwe with a number of comrades here during the 80s, and the health system was functioning very well. The key problem, and this is a question which we have to understand when we view other countries, is that the lack of democratic practice within ZANU and then amongst people within the country, saw this with the emergence of the opposition there, MDC, the intolerance and so on. This is something which endangers the very freedom and democracy which we're meant to be building and developing. So this is a key problem. The issue of land is a very real issue in Zimbabwe, more than in South Africa even. I'm not saying it's not here, but much more, because there's much more of a peasant-based people in Zimbabwe. And this question of control of the land and dealing with the needs of the people is something which one understood. But again, the methods in which this was implemented was a resort to unnecessary violence and thuggery, which has created such a problem. And in dealing with the MDC as well. And you know, when we talk about the need for tolerance in society, it's Chris Hani who I always think of. It's not just because we all love Chris Hani, I'm being very honest with you, because when we came back into the country, Chris was the first of the ANC and the party comrades, leaders, all rank and file, who said we must be tolerant of opposing views. He was that kind of a person. And he used to mention this in exile as well, when there were debates and there was sometimes angry disagreement. It brings me to the last question, the selectivity in dealing with countries where you say we're very muted in our critiques of countries like, say, Cuba, you might add Vietnam, and African countries and so on. But you see, in relation to a worldview, in terms of forces that are dominating the world, and you might disagree with me, of course, but imperialist forces led by the United States and the Pax Americana, that these are the forces and have been, together with Israel, dictating the situation from Afghanistan to Iraq to Libya to Syria, the Palestine-Israeli situation. And in fact, the very forces that from the inception of the Cuban Revolution were hell-set on smashing socialism in Cuba. So yes, every one of these states, and of course if we're dealing with despotic states, such as Syria and Iraq under Saddam and so on, the problems there and the tyranny is far worse than a Vietnam or a Cuba, and actually even far worse than Zimbabwe. But in the big picture, in relation to where we stand in the world and where we stood in this whole period which my book covers, we're looking at revolution and we're looking at repression. We're looking at change and we're looking at the conservative forces that want to keep people under the control that they were from colonial times and so on. And it then is a question of who is standing for emancipation and liberation of people and countries to be truly independent. And in relation to this, I have absolutely no apology in what I write and what I say to stand with those that are for the emancipation of humanity, against those, I don't expect you to believe me and agree with me. I'm answering you and I'm saying where I stand. I see where you stand, and I'm not condemning you. It's a debate. I'm not wanting to make you feel bad. It's your views. But these are class differences that we have, that you have and that I have. And that's the side that I'm on. And I will be on that side until my dying day, because I stand for that. And we are critical of people who we allied with. So there's that critique which Professor Webster made reference to, which other young lady did here, about the GDR, about the Soviet Union. And in a period when I wrote this book, the Soviet Union no longer exists. We were fighting a life and death struggle against apartheid. And apartheid, Pretoria, supported by the Americans and the British and West Germany and the French. And our friends from Cuba to China to Vietnam to the Soviet Union were standing with us and were giving us all the assistance to overthrow this racist regime in South Africa. So on that basis, I would be careful in the way I formulated my critique. I do say this, that in looking at the book, that I could have, if I was writing it today, I probably would have been somewhat stronger in the critique. But I was writing this book mainly in a period where that life and death struggle was very, very vicious. But as I say this, and we look at this benighted world today, and what American imperialism and Western capital is doing to the rest of the world, I've got absolutely no hesitation in branding them the forces of evil, and that I will stand with those who are standing for human liberty. Did you want to answer any of these? Sorry, I
Okay.
no.
Firstly, on David Webster, who was assassinated on the 1st of May 1989. David was a colleague, a comrade, and a close friend, a soul brother, but we didn't share the same mother and father. Can I just respond to Ronnie on his, I thought, wonderful example of the response of Norway compared to the United Kingdom. I thought that was a very interesting argument as to how you could use your natural resources, which belong to all of us, how you could use those resources for the upliftment of the people, rather than for the private accumulation of a very small number of people. And it's an extraordinarily good example of how Norway, when they discovered oil, created this sovereign fund and used it for the benefit of the people. It's such a dramatic example when you compare how we used our platinum. And that's the question that interests me and really puzzles me. We have 75% of the world's platinum. Why on earth don't we control the price? Yeah. No, but what? I mean, it doesn't make sense. If we own all of the platinum, so why don't we control the price? Yes.
If you go to the platinum mine, a client of mine worked in the mine, there's a concrete structure with massive satellite dishes, and I asked him, what's that about? He says, what that is, they're in constant contact to the markets in London and Europe. And as a miner, I shift past the I get sent underground. We get told to hold back on the yield, so we cause a scarcity. And that obviously pushes the price up. We then push up production. So there is an amount, there's a degree of...
So you agree with me?
They try and control...
We should control the
supply
market.
and demand. Well, that's what they're doing. I mean, they do control the price.
No.
But you can't have another Aurora disaster.
No, they're not controlled by one or two gentlemen in London. I mean, we the people. We the people. Not, and I don't, you know, nationalisation, I don't particularly, the word nationalisation doesn't really attract me actually, because that often ends up with a small group in the state controlling it. Instead of, what I'm talking about, something that's democratically controlled. For me, you know, if there is an alternative to capitalism, and if it's socialism, it's not socialism unless it's democratic. It's got to be democratic. That to me is the key point. So my response to, I think, a wonderful argument of yours. We can control the price of platinum by holding back when we want to push up the price, and put it on the market, we want to lower that. But the benefits of that, the surplus, must come to the people of Southern Africa.
Take a leaf out of Australia's book.
Yes.
Nationalised, they haven't got committees and bureaucrats running something.
Well, we seem to be on the same side here. I mean, I think that's.
We are seeing which is modicum of successful socialism.
Anyway, that would be. I think that would have been the kind of path that our radical gentleman over here is suggesting. That would be the path that we could have taken with our platinum industry. Yeah.
Good evening. My name is Hamilton Marks. Dr. Van Vieren, with your introduction of Mr. Ronnie Kasrils, you introduced him as he was a member of the ANC, he was a member of the Communist Party. Please correct me on that one. And then also, Ronnie said that the ANC has a collective leadership. And we are made to understand that issues are robustly discussed, issues are interrogated, and yet they allowed Madiba to get away with the issue of nationalization. That does not necessarily mean that I support nationalization, but then I'll take the AIDS denialism of Thabo Mbeki, where everybody was scared to challenge him on the subject. It was muted. Okay, so I don't seem to understand this collective sharing of ideas and interrogation of issues. And then Professor Webster, I kind of liked his idea of the demise of social movements like the UDF, which was a strategy by the ANC to get rid of the UDF, because the UDF was the coalface of the struggle. The other issue that Professor Webster brought up is the Chris Hani issue. And here again, it makes me think of a JFK scenario where Chris Hani was regarded as a threat because he wanted to get back to base, and somebody, it was an inside job. This has been a conspiracy theory, but that kind of argument gives credence to that conspiracy theory, that there's a much bigger picture out there.
Thank you very much.
My name is Stefan Pauli. Different to the two gentlemen here, I wasn't sitting close to the mountain, but a little bit far away from the mountain, watching both sides as a foreign correspondent. And my first question is, wasn't it a strategic mistake? I think that's more for Professor Webster. Wasn't it a strategic mistake that the labor movement basically joined in and was overshadowed by the ANC instead of keeping their own ideas for themselves and being possibly in an alliance but not overshadowed by a political party? And the second question to Ronnie Kasrils, I think I asked you that about 20 years ago. The labor movement, they have their own leaders. You can see that worldwide. Do they really need a political party to tell them which way to go, or shouldn't they also go with their own leaders that they have, that come from within their own ranks and not from ideological things? I'm not against parties or something like that, but I don't think that the labor movement needs to be told by anybody which way to go. And I didn't get these answers 20 years ago. I would be interested if I get it now. And Professor Wexford, just as an additional remark to that, you mentioned Norway. In Norway, it weren't the political parties to go for this solution that has this fund that goes even for 100 years ahead, what is a great thing. It was very much the labor movement itself who made that deal with the political parties as it was independent, as an independent labor movement, and not part of a political group that is overshadowed by one party.
Thank you. One more question?
Thank you. Mr. Kasrils, you mentioned something that one of our main concern as young people, that today we're living at a time whereby people are forgotten what the struggle was all about. Which is, I think, the way I view it. Also, Professor mentioned the issue of our own resources. Which currently we are saying, yes, we are living in a democratic nation. I remember the president on his national address, 2009, he said, we need to develop a collective national will in order to change the economy of South Africa. Also ensuring that we are all sharing equitable benefit, especially the poor people. I'm living in an area whereby there are 5 mines. But if you're looking at the area and even the schools around, there's no even a progress. Also, you're looking also, as Professor mentioned, that area's resources has been already extracted, but there is no benefit for the community around. Then you question that, also again, if you investigate some of those mine owners, are more people that are belonging to the government, that they fought for us. Then you tend to question whether the aim was really to fight for the apartheid system with no action plan after that, because right now it seems like there have been so much. I've been looking at the document of the International Action Plan of 2011 and 2012. I went to a document of the National Advanced Manufacturing Strategy that also was developed in 2003. We aim that the minerals of South Africa, we have to instead of us actually exporting it, being able to make it to the final product. But then again, my challenge as a young person, I'm trying to find out, that really, it seems like those people, they've forgotten. The comrades have forgotten what the struggle was all about. Maybe, I'm asking to you, Mr. Ronnie, maybe it's us young people saying, maybe not understanding the struggle. But where we're seeing it, where with everything that's happening around, we think they've already missed the point. Thank you.
I wanted to respond to 3. Firstly, on the question of Chris Heine's assassination, I don't. If the implication of your question was that it was internal to the ANC, then I don't see any evidence for that. I thought that it had been clearly established who the killers of Chris Hani were. That's Darby Lewis and Janus Wallace, who assassinated him, and they're still in prison. I think that for me, the significance of the reason why they assassinated him is because at the Congress of 1992, the ANC Congress, he got the second highest votes. In other words, he was the second most popular to Nelson Mandela. And had he lived, he would have taken us, I think, in the direction that Ronnie's implying. I don't think it would have been a revolutionary socialist path, by the way. I think it would have been a sort of social democratic path, given the global context. But that's just an opinion. But I think it's straightforward why Chris Hani was assassinated. He was a threat to the establishment in South Africa. That's my view, and that's why they're still inside. The question about the COSATU strategic mistake, I think, that when COSATU entered in alliance in November 1985 with the ANC, and when Jay Naidu went to Lusaka and they started their first conversations, the understanding was quite unequivocal on COSATU's part. This was an equal partnership. That's the key point. So, and I think that I think what happened when the ANC came to power, it became the hegemonic force because it now controlled the state. And it was difficult to retain that kind of equality between the two. So I think the question for me is not, I look upon the alliance a bit like a Catholic marriage. I think, that you can have affairs on the side, but you're not going to be able, there's no divorce. There's no divorce. I think that you can redefine that relationship, and I think that that's the issue, to have a more equal relationship. But that's, again, interesting. Just the final point about Norway. Oh, okay. That was a wonderful example. I don't know who was the gentleman who it was about Norway, because that it came out of, it wasn't a particular political party. It was more of a national movement that was saying these are our resources, they belong to the people of Norway. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Eddie's really dealt with everything. I would say to the first questioner, thank you very much. You talk about whether I'm a member of the ANC Communist Party or not. Maybe it was implied in your statement, your question. But I was introduced by Dr. Annette Jansen van Vuren in terms of the book and what I had been. She's got no idea whether I'm a member of the ANC or the Communist Party. She didn't even ask me. And when she said in that period he has been, this in the ANC and that in the Communist Party, I didn't feel I had to jump up and say, Professor, I still am a member. But, in terms of your inquiry, I'm not a member in the sense of belonging to any organised structure anymore of the ANC or the Communist Party, but I consider myself a member. I don't pay subs, but I don't think that many people in the ANC and the Communist Party pay subs anymore. I certainly don't see at present, I don't see any, and this is something that's worthy of discussion, obviously at other occasions, etc. I don't see any force in this country outside of what's called the Tripartite Alliance, COSATU included, that can bring about the possibility of change. Certainly not the opposition and not the DA, Business Persons Party and so on. And which is why, for me, I feel that we need to do what we can to revitalise that alliance, which is, you quoted me having written that. On the question of Chris Hani's assassination, as with Professor Webster, there's never been anything to show anyone within the movement responsible for this. And it's been quite clear who the killers were. I know where the rumour's coming from, and I see you putting up your hand. And I want to say this, because the Young Communist League often mentioned Thabo Mbeki. And that is, well, this is rubbish. It's just such nonsense. Why Thabo Mbeki? Because they were rivals. When Chris Hani decided in 1992, that he would stand as Secretary General of our party, I was very much part of the leadership and a supporter and very close to Chris. and not terribly in favour of Thabo Mbeki, a man who I've always respected and a brain that I've respected. I'm not saying that agree with. And I said to Chris, do you realise, Chris, by now standing to be the leader of the Communist Party, you're giving up any possibility of being the leader of the ANC. And I said to him, and you're leaving it to Thabo. Thabo Mbeki knew that, as everybody knew, that the moment Chris became the leader of the Communist Party, that there's no way in the South Africa that we know, unless there'd been a mighty red revolution, that Chris could have then rivaled him for leadership of the ANC. So it just really doesn't stand up. And then to my dear friend, Stefan, you said 20 years ago that you asked me the question about why, as I recall, the COSATU leadership had to follow a leadership of the ANC and the Communist Party and so on. Eh? Well, the reason isn't that that was being forced on COSATU at that time, but it is used the word hegemony, the leadership, the domination, the heights of the state and that control. Within that alliance, within the struggle, the Communist Party and the ANC, there was such an aura about that leadership and the underground party and ANC and MK, that when we came back, and exile leaders, when we came back, it's not that the exile leadership had to conspire. How would we dominate? From the time we were meeting, from Jay to Cyril Ramaphosa and Sydney Mufamadi, people, whether we were in the country underground meeting them or they came to Lusaka or London, they simply accepted that leadership and ANC Communist Party. So I would say that the answer is more that in terms of that alliance and the liberation struggle as it was, that people looked naturally to the ANC and the party leadership. And if you were from the working class, you looked to the party as your leadership, and that's where you wanted to take your line. The general masses of our country and the UDF people and so on, they looked to the ANC. It happened that way. I think what's been happening now, because of the way the ANC's leadership has been behaving and the way the integrity has been eroding, that people now, and we see this with Comrade Vavi, whatever that question of his dalliance with a lady which was stupid at work, that we've seen over the last year, especially with the Zuma leadership, that there is from the working class, from within the trade union, more of a concern about that leadership. And I think this is a good thing. Not that I'm anti or pro Zuma, but that we're coming closer to what you're talking about. That if we are to move towards, which I would hope to see in my lifetime, which is soon coming to an end given the age that are in my old bones, but that we should move towards socialism, and even if it's a social democratic outcome, I would greatly prefer that to the kind of mishmash that we have in the country at the moment, not using a very political term there, but you know what I mean by mishmash.